Welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to pick up one of the images I took while I was recording my previous video. We're going to have a look at what I did to it in Lightroom just to turn it into that final image you see on the screen now. If you remember, we were at a place called Wagner's Wells in Surrey. I'll put the link to the previous video in a card above. And Wagner's Wells is a really nice area in the Surrey countryside. It's full of mature beech trees. It's quite a steep valley with a stream at the bottom and some man-made ponds. So it's quite damp. There's a lot of lichens. There's about 90 different types there, a lot of moss. In the winter there's limited light, so it has quite a moody feel. It's not a grand vista, so really when I was taking photos there, it was quite interesting trying to take photos and images while I was videoing. Adds a little bit of pressure to the scene because I felt I had to try and create some credible images. Hopefully the three you've seen you like, and I've just picked this one to really look at. And really for my inspiration on this one in the post-processing, I wanted to focus in on some of the details, some of the mosses and the shapes and the colours of that forest, and give it a slightly moody feel with a dark background. I use Lightroom Classic for probably about 90–95% of what I do to most of my images, so let's switch over to that now and take a look at the image. So here we are in Lightroom Classic, the latest version that you get with the Creative Cloud subscription. On the left you've got the original image as taken straight from the camera and imported into Lightroom, and on the right we've got my final version. I tend to shoot in RAW just because it gives you more latitude to make some adjustments after the event in post-processing. This was taken with my Nikon Z7 with its 24-70 f4 lens. Gives it a really big image because obviously it's a 45 megapixel sensor, so you get about 5,500 on the short pixels on the short edge, 8,200 on the long edge, which is really good for being able to make adjustments and crop in, yet still be able to print at up to sort of A2 size. It was taken at about 48mm on the lens, 1/50th of a second at f8 and ISO 800. So I was really, when I was taking this image, I was looking at the lines from the roots of the tree with the ridge of moss moving off into the background. So we had two lots of lines that combined there, which I quite liked. I also saw the gnarled bark on the tree and quite liked that. And that moss, it really has, you can see the individual leaves or fronds on it, and that vibrant green really is quite atmospheric. So I shot it in aperture priority at f8. I tried it at f4 as well, but f8 gave me enough depth of field to have some foreground interest and also allow me to play around with the crop when I get back into post-processing. So the first thing I tend to do when I'm looking at creating an image is I will go in and I'll create a virtual copy. So I never really play with that original Nikon RAW file. I create a second version because then I can always go back to the very start without undoing my non-destructive edits and create a second version to see if a different approach would create something better. Because for me, photography is about blending together science and art. The science is getting the best image you can with the light and getting the settings right to give you a really credible base image. But then when you get into post-processing, it's about playing around with it and seeing what you can do to create the right image for what your vision is. You're more of an artist than the scientist, and that for me is a real attraction to photography. So let's switch over into the develop mode and take a look at the image. I tend to start off looking at the basic panel and really just getting the basics right in the image. In this case, I could see the image wasn't working for me. There was too much clutter around the top and around the side for it to really work. So I was already in my mind moving towards something like a 5x4 or a square crop, and I tend to mess around with it and just see how it looks. So I think on this one I looked at whether I kept that gnarled bark. As I say, I saw that gnarled bark really appealed to me. However, it didn't quite work, so just bringing it in is where the benefit of the large sensor size really comes into its own. So we can crop in and still have an image that is a really good size for printing. In the basics panel, I then tend to look at the exposure because I have a tendency to slightly underexpose with my Nikon cameras. Have the and the Z7, I know they've got amazing dynamic range, and therefore really exposing to ensure you don't have any blown out highlights. But if that means the shadows are slightly dark, I know I can pull a lot of detail out of those. So I tend to underexpose on these, but on this case I wanted to have a slightly moody feel, so I sort of just thought, okay, let's bring down the exposure a little bit. So I really brought it down. That looks about right there. And I also brought down the contrast just to give it a bit more latitude there. Moving down, I really wanted to bring down the highlights in this because there were some quite bright areas around the photo, and you can be quite bold with some of these. You can really bring it down and see what it does. I wanted to keep some of the highlights there, but take out quite a few of them. And then bring up the shadows a little bit just to bring out an element of the texture in that moss, that really nice texture. Now, one of the things that's really good is if you look up here in the histogram, you've got these two triangles which tell you really where you're starting to blow out. So the blue one here is indicating that the blues are starting to disappear in the shadows. If you click on that triangle, what you can do is you can start to then play with the blacks, but what it shows you on your image, as you'll see up here, is it shows you where in the image you're starting to lose the details. You can do the same for the highlights as well. So what that helps you is when you're playing with the blacks and the whites to get the black and white point, you can just adjust it so that you're right on the edge there. You don't lose important parts of the image. So I tend to just play around with these blacks and whites to see where I think it's right. So I think actually we can probably bring the whites up a little bit to just give the highlights a little bit of pop. We perhaps need to just have the blacks end up about there, and that started to give me the texture in the moss. I'm looking at the texture in the center here in this sort of foreground, this bit here, and really trying to think, okay, well, if I can have that stand out, I can make the background slightly more darker, slightly more moody. I tend to process in a sort of two-step way. I like to create a really strong base image, which is what I've done here. We've got the textures right, we've got broadly the exposures right. I can see then how I could take it down a number of different routes with further post-processing to create different ambiances with it. Now, there's two ways you can do this in baking in these settings. You can export it as a TIFF and then work from that TIFF. Or what I tend to do is I tend to use the Nik collection of little apps to really look at things like sharpening. And what that does is not only does it take you out, so you go into edit in and you come down to, I use the output sharpener mainly, and you can choose to send it out to the sharpener with all of your Lightroom adjustments in. So we just accept that, and what you'll see is the sharpener will pop up. Because what the Lightroom is doing now is it's exporting the image as a TIFF. So it's baking in all of those adjustments you've made. It takes it out into sharpener. And what you can do here is you can choose to put some sharpening into it or not. I want a little bit because you see that it just gives a little bit more definition to the edges, which you have to be really zoomed in to see. But I'm just going to use it as it's recommending on this. And you save it. And what that then does is re-export your image as a TIFF file. So what you'll see it's done is it's just created a TIFF file with -edit 2 at the end there. and I tend to just give it another star to show it's the base layer up from my 2-star image, which was the one I've just worked on, that copy. I will tend to, because I'm always creating a route where I can jump off and do different styles, I will tend to create another virtual image here. And let's go into develop again. So what I'll do now is I'll start to work on the tone curve to get the colors right. I know I want to try and bring a bit of a more moody ambience to this image and draw out the greens whilst taking the shadows down. So what I'll probably start with is just by bringing up the shadows here to take out some of those, and then drop down the shadows so it creates quite a dark, moody image, but I still want some of the mid-tones to just give it a bit of a pop, and I want the highlights to just come out a little bit. You know, small movements on the tone curve can have quite a big effect. That's quite good as a starting point, but I think the greens we need to work on a little bit here. If you drop the greens, what it does is it takes greens out of the shadows, and the opposite of the greens is the sort of reds and magentas. So what that is going the wrong way for me. I don't want it to go quite that high. As you can see, you know, small moves make quite big changes to this. So I want the greens to really pop, but then what I want to do is perhaps drop down the reds at the bottom, but I do want to bring out some of the reds in these leaves up here. So we can just play around with both the higher end, the mids and highlights. I think we're starting to get there. I can also see some blues that would be good to bring out. You see a slightly bluer tinge in those holly leaves in the background. So what we can try and do is perhaps take those highlights up to bring them up there. Perhaps bring down the blues very slightly there. And then come back to... I've taken this up a little bit too far. Let's take down those shadows. It's a game of trial and error in a lot of this, and just moving around, trying to get the feel you want from this. What I'm also seeing here is at this point I tend to just look at it full screen, see whether it's starting to get where I want it to. I'm not sure whether it's slightly too much red in there still, so it's starting to look more like my final one. So I'm seeing some distracting elements down here. This particular area down here to me is quite distracting, so we can use the heal tool to perhaps move some of this moss around. Now what you'll see is we can create a bit of an edge there so it looks quite natural, but this piece in the middle of this one is replicated over here, so it looks like it's a cut and paste. So what we're going to do is you have to just work through a little bit of a strategy and try and work out how you play with that without making too many changes, I always think. But there we've got, we can perhaps, that's about right. If we now come down and select this area, I don't want that one, I want something like that. You can see it's starting to fit a lot better there. I'm also seeing this little highlight here, and a lot about this is about attention to detail. I'm seeing this little highlight is just distracting me. Maybe it's up here it will come from. There we go. And also this patch up here is drawing my eye away. Now that won't matter too much in the final image because we'll probably put a vignette on it round, but that's better. We've started to get rid of some of those distractions that lead the eye away from where you want it to be. Now I saw this line, and I like this line leading to the line of moss going up here, but I want to draw out this edge and the detail in the moss and the fronds of moss there. So what we can use is a radial. Let's get the right sort of shape, turn it to the right angle, bring it down. I think it's too long there, because what we want to do is just adjust the detail and the highlight along this leading edge of moss. So I've created a radial. Now if we make adjustments to this radial, it'll adjust everything outside of the radial. So what you have to do is just click on invert over there. It's now flipped it, so it will adjust what's inside. So if we now push up the exposure, you can see it's doing what we want inside, so we won't go quite that radical, but we'll just take up the exposure here to draw the viewer's eye in. We can also play around with perhaps the highlights and the shadows, perhaps a little bit of the blacks and the whites, and perhaps a bit of contrast, and perhaps a bit of clarity and sharpness, just to really draw the eye into that area. And that's looking a bit better. Now you can look at, if you look at the backslash key, you can jump from what it was before to what it is now, so you can start to see how much we've changed it. And then what we're going to do is just put a bit of a vignette on here to again just give it that feel and draw the eye in. Perhaps bring the mid layer up there. It's always worth just checking when you're making vignette adjustments, and quite big adjustments, check the thumbnail up here, because what it looks like when it's a large image on your screen can be very much different from what you see when it's a much smaller image, perhaps a web-based image, or what you'll see on a mobile phone. And it can, at that size, it can over accentuate things like a vignette. So I think that's looking broadly balanced. So let's now flip to see how it looks versus the one that I created the other day. So let's just put the two up on the screen next to each other, see how close I got it the second time round. As you can see, a very subtly different image this time. I think I like the previous one slightly. I can tell you what the previous one has is very slightly in the tone curve. If we go back to the RGB, is my gut feel is that is slightly taken out the blacks, the shadows very slightly more. It'll be something a bit more like that. Let's look at the two again. You can see, yep, we're getting pretty close there. The one I created the other day, I prefer a slightly yellower image, yellower and green. But there you have it. So hopefully that's helped you see how you can really change the ambience of an image. Let's put the original back into the mix, which is that one there. So there you have the original on the left, the one I did the other day in the middle, and the one we've just done on the right. So a few simple changes, all done within Lightroom, apart from the all could be done within Lightroom. I used the sharpener app from DxO, but you can easily just export to TIFF and not sharpen there, use the in Lightroom sharpener. So as always, any comments, leave them below. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to interacting with you again next time.